The world had shrunk to 3 sensations. The first was the throbbing, fiery pain in his leg, where a shrapnel fragment had torn through flesh. The second was the sticky, suffocating heat of the field hospital tent. And the third, the most powerful of all, was fear. A Japanese soldier lies on a cot. He is a prisoner. To him, that word is more terrifying than death. Since childhood, it had been drilled into his head. Never surrender, death before dishonor. His propaganda had painted a clear picture of what awaited him. The Americans were Kichiku Beihei, demon beasts. They would torture him. They would tear out his fingernails, gouge out his eyes, and defile his body to extract military secrets. He prepares for it. His body may be broken, but his spirit never will be. He repeats the names of his ancestors to himself. He recalls the face of the emperor. He is ready to die with dignity. He will not say a word. Footsteps. One of them enters the tent, tall, fair-haired, a white devil. He doesn't look at the soldier as a human being. In his hands are gleaming metal instruments. The soldier squeezes his eyes shut. This is it. It's about to begin. He braces for the touch of hot iron or the cold blade of a knife. Instead, he feels his trouser leg being carefully cut away, then the touch of something cold and wet, the sharp smell of alcohol. He opens his eyes and sees the American medic frowning in concentration, cleaning his ragged wound. The soldier is bewildered. What is this? Some new sophisticated form of torture? The American says something in his barbaric language, then picks up a syringe with a long needle. Inside is a yellowish liquid. Poison, the soldier thinks. They will kill him like a dog. He closes his eyes again, ready to accept death. He feels a slight prick in his shoulder. A minute passes, then 2. He is not dying. The pain in his leg, it hasn't vanished, but the fever surrounding it seems to begin to subside. The Japanese soldier could not have known it, but one of the most valuable, closely guarded, and revolutionary substances on the planet had just been introduced into his body. A weapon that changed the world. And that injection, this act of almost divine healing, would break his spirit far more effectively than any knife or blowtorch. Why did the Japanese soldier so eagerly anticipate torture? Because his entire world was built on that certainty. Propaganda in Imperial Japan was all-encompassing. From kindergarten, children were told stories of Western cruelty and barbarism. Newspapers, films, radio all spoke with one voice. Americans were not civilized people. They lacked honor, disrespected the fallen, and mocked the weak. Posters depicted American soldiers as demons with horns and fangs, devouring Japanese women and children. Before being sent to the front, soldiers were lectured on the specific tortures that awaited them in captivity. This was a deliberate policy with 2 objectives. The first was to intensify hatred for the enemy. The second, and most important, was to prevent surrender. In the code of Bushido, upon which the officer corps was raised, surrender was an absolute, indelible disgrace. A warrior had to fight to the end, and if defeat was inevitable, he had to die, either in a final suicidal banzai charge or by his own hand. This idea was called Gyokusai, the shattered jewel. It was better to be smashed into 1,000 glittering shards like a precious gem than to remain whole but a dishonoured piece of roof tile. And this ideology worked. In the early years of the war, Americans took almost no prisoners. The Japanese either fought to the last man or killed themselves. On Okinawa, thousands of civilians, including women and children, threw themselves from cliffs, believing that a fate worse than death awaited them. The reality of the war, unfortunately, often validated these fears. The Pacific War was a war of extermination. Brutality was the norm on both sides. American soldiers, after seeing their comrades killed by soldiers feigning death or by prisoners who blew themselves up along with their guards, stopped trusting anyone. Wounded Japanese were often finished off to avoid the risk. Thus, a vicious cycle of hatred was created. The Japanese didn't surrender because they feared torture. The Americans stopped taking prisoners because the Japanese wouldn't surrender. And so our soldier lies on his cot. His entire life, his culture, his combat experience, everything screams at him that the man in the American uniform has come to inflict pain. His world was starkly black and white. On one side, honor, duty, and a glorious death. On the other, shame, torture, and the beastly cruelty of the enemy. He could never have been prepared for the fact that this enemy would pull a miracle from his pocket, not a knife. What was in that syringe? Penicillin. Today the word sounds commonplace. It's just an antibiotic you can get it at any pharmacy. But until before, the word sounded like magic. The story of its discovery is legendary. In 1928, Scottish scientist Alexander Fleming accidentally left a petri dish with bacteria on his lab bench. When he returned, he saw that mould had grown in the dish, and all the bacteria around it had died. He realised the mould was secreting some kind of killer substance. He named it penicillin. But discovery is one thing, production is another. For a decade, scientists couldn't produce enough pure penicillin to treat even a single person. It was a laboratory curiosity. And then came the Second World War. War isn't just death from bullets, it's death from infection. Any wound, no matter how trivial, could lead to gangrene, blood poisoning, and an agonizing death. In World War I, more soldiers died from disease and infection than from weapons. The US government understood whoever first obtained an antibiotic would gain a colossal military advantage. And so America threw its full industrial and scientific might behind penicillin production. It was a medical Manhattan project of sorts. Dozens of universities and pharmaceutical companies, including Pfizer, Merck, and Squibb, joined forces. They searched for new, more productive strains of mould. Legend has it that the best strain was found on a mouldy cantaloupe at a market in Illinois. They developed deep tank fermentation technology in giant vats, similar to those used for brewing beer. By 1943, they were producing enough penicillin to supply the entire army. By 1944, for D-Day, they had millions of doses. Penicillin changed the rules of the game. The mortality rate from bacterial pneumonia in the US Army dropped from 18% to less than 1%. Surgeries that were once a death sentence due to the risk of infection became routine. It saved thousands, tens of thousands of lives. And it was a strategic weapon. The technology for its mass production was one of the most closely guarded secrets, on par with the atomic bomb. Germany and Japan desperately tried to create their own antibiotics, but their programs failed. They had neither the resources nor the technology. So when the American medic injected that yellow liquid into the Japanese soldier's body, he wasn't just administering medicine. He was injecting the concentrated power of American science, industry, and logistics. He was sharing one of his country's most valuable military resources, gold that grew on mould. A short circuit occurs in the Japanese soldier's mind. The programming instilled in him cannot process the new data. In his world, there were only two options: a swift death in battle or an agonizing death in captivity. There was no third option. But here, something else is happening. Something that doesn't fit into any category. They are not inflicting pain, they are alleviating it. They are not killing him, they are healing him. The enemy, who is supposed to be a devil, is behaving like a doctor. Why? This question shatters his mind. He tries to find a logical explanation. Perhaps it's a trick. They're healing him so they can torture him later with renewed vigour. This thought seems the most plausible. At least it fits into his worldview. But the days pass. His wound begins to heal. The fever subsides. They come to change his dressings, bring him food. No one yells at him. No one beats him. And then he begins to understand that it's not a trick. It's something far more complex. In reality, the Americans were driven by two entirely different, yet not contradictory logics. Logic number one, humanism. Despite all the brutality of war, the Geneva Convention formed the basis of American and Western military doctrine. There were rules. Prisoners could not be tortured. The wounded had to be given aid. For many American medics, this wasn't just a rule but a personal moral code. The Hippocratic Oath made no distinction between friend and foe. Before them was simply a wounded man who needed help. But there was also logic number two, cold pragmatism. By 1944, the American command realized that the Japanese ideology of death before dishonor was creating a huge problem. They couldn't get intelligence, and without information on troop positions, fortifications, plans, the Americans were losing thousands of their own soldiers. They had to break this ideology. They had to convince the Japanese that surrendering wasn't terrifying, that it was an option. And this is where treating prisoners became a part of psychological warfare. A dead prisoner is useless. A terrified and broken prisoner will likely stay silent or lie. But a prisoner whose life has just been clean, who has been fed, given a cigarette, he is in a state of profound psychological shock. His world has collapsed. His brain is desperately searching for something to hold on to, and he feels gratitude. American intelligence officers who worked with prisoners quickly realized that kindness and mercy were far more effective tools for gathering information than torture. Their psychological break was complete. The soldier who was prepared to endure any physical pain was utterly defenseless against an act of inexplicable kindness. When the initial shock subsided, the Japanese soldier's mind, trained in analysis and discipline, began to ask the right questions. Not, why are they being kind to me, but why can they afford to be kind to me? And the answer to that question was more terrifying than any propaganda. He lay on his cot and thought. This medicine, penicillin, it was obviously very rare and valuable. If the Japanese army had it, it would be given only to the highest-ranking officers. Yet these men were injecting it into a common enemy soldier they didn't even know. What did that mean? It meant they had a lot. So much that they could afford to waste it on expendable material. Like a rich man tossing coins to a beggar. And then his mind began to connect the dots. Behind that single injection stood an entire invisible army. An army of scientists. People in white lab coats in laboratories somewhere in Chicago or New York who figured out how to turn mold into medicine. An army of workers. Thousands of men and women in Pfizer factories standing by giant fermentation tanks producing this magic by the ton. An army of logisticians, ships, planes and trucks that transport these fragile glass vials across 10,000 miles of hostile ocean, through jungles under fire, and deliver them to this tent on this godforsaken island. And it all works, like clockwork. He remembered his own army, an army where soldiers were dying from malaria and dysentery, where a simple aspirin tablet was considered a luxury, where he was told to conserve every bullet and every handful of rice. His country was at its limit. It was squeezing out its last resources to wage this war. And his enemy seemed to be fighting this war without breaking a sweat. He was so rich, so powerful, so technologically superior that he could afford the most unthinkable, most extravagant gesture, healing his enemies. That shot of penicillin was not an act of mercy. It was a demonstration of power. It was like one fighter in a fist fight suddenly pulling out a wad of cash and fanning himself with it. It was humiliating. It was crushing. The Japanese soldier realized he wasn't fighting an 18-year-old kid from Ohio. He was fighting a civilization that had learned to tame mold and turn it into a weapon. And in that moment, he understood that his courage, his duty, his willingness to die, none of it mattered. He could be the greatest warrior in the world, but he could not fight a factory. He could not fight a laboratory. The war was lost. Not here on this island, but there, in the distant, incomprehensible world of white lab coats and steel conveyor belts. After the field hospital, the soldier is sent to a prisoner of war camp, perhaps in Australia, New Zealand, or even Hawaii. And here, the second phase of his psychological breakdown begins. The Americans quickly realized that Japanese prisoners were a blank slate. Their old world had collapsed, and that they were ready to absorb new information. So the Americans began a deliberate program of re-education. This was not harsh indoctrination. It was a gentle, almost imperceptible immersion into another reality. Food. Instead of a meagre ration of rice, he is given 3 full meals a day. Meat, bread, butter, coffee with sugar, even dessert. For a man who had been malnourished for years, this was a culture shock. He ate more as a prisoner than he ever did in his home village. Information. He is given magazines to read. Life, the Saturday Evening Post. He looks at the pictures, advertisements for cars, refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, smiling families at picnics. He sees a country that is not just surviving the war, it is thriving. He watches movies, Hollywood films, documentaries. He sees the scale of America, its cities, its factories, its people, attitude. Translators speak with him, often Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans. They tell him about America, about democracy, about freedom. They don't shout. They engage in dialogue. They answer his questions, and the reality he sees with his own eyes directly contradicts everything he was taught. Propaganda said America was a decadent, weak nation. He sees its incredible power. Propaganda said Americans were cruel barbarians. He sees disciplined guards and the doctors who saved his life. Propaganda said his mission was sacred. He begins to suspect he was just used as cannon fodder in a hopeless war. A process that could be called ideological death takes place. The warrior's identity, built on the code of Bushido, on absolute faith in the emperor's divinity and on hatred for the enemy, cannot withstand the collision with reality. It crumbles to dust. His physical wound has healed, but in its place is a spiritual wound, an emptiness. The old world is dead and a new one has not yet been born. He is no longer a soldier of the emperor, but he is not yet anyone else. He is no one, and for many Japanese prisoners, this state of being no one became the beginning of a new life. After the war, thousands of them refused to return to Japan. They feared the shame. Many emigrated to the United States or other countries. They chose a new life that began for them with a simple injection in the shoulder. Let's return to that syringe, to that needle. Throughout the war, America created many terrifying weapons: carpet bombing, napalm, and finally the atomic bomb, a weapon capable of wiping cities off the face of the earth. But perhaps the most powerful, most subversive weapon it used was not one that took life, but one that gave it. Penicillin. A bomb can destroy the body, but it often only strengthens the spirit of the survivors. It creates martyrs, breeds hatred, and fuels a desire for revenge. An act of inexplicable mercy works differently. It doesn't strike the body, it strikes at the very idea for which the enemy is fighting. The Japanese soldier was prepared to die from an American bullet. That would have been an honor. He was prepared to die from American torture. That would have been martyrdom. But he was completely unprepared to survive because of American medicine. That was humiliating. It stripped his sacrifice of meaning. It robbed him of his right to a noble death. It turned his tragedy into a strange, uncomfortable farce. The shot of penicillin was not just a medical treatment. It was a statement. It was a quiet but deafening message that said, "We are so powerful that we can afford not to hate you. We are so wealthy that we can afford to heal you. Your war, your code, your hatred, it is all so petty and insignificant compared to our might that we can simply cure you and move on." This was not just a victory in war, it was a victory of civilization, a victory of science over fanaticism, a victory of the industrial assembly line over the samurai sword, a victory of soft power over brute force. Ultimately, the cruelest and most devastating blow America dealt the soldier was an act of kindness. And in this detest, complex and profoundly human irony lies one of the most important and uncomfortable lessons of that war.